TorahCafe.com.
So let me begin with a little story, as I've been doing continuously over this weekend. This one is about Marvin and Sadie, and they are well into their 80s, and they are in robust health. And the latter part of their lives was particularly elongated on account of the fact that Sadie was exceptional in the way she focused on healthy cooking for her husband. But even that couldn't save them when they went on their celebration cruise, which unfortunately sunk. And they suddenly find themselves standing in the heavens, and they're standing before this palatial home. And all of a sudden a voice comes out and says, "Please go inside, this is yours." And he's thinking to himself, my goodness, how on earth am I going to afford the mortgage on this place? It's ridiculous. And the voice says, it's yours, it's your reward for all the goodness that you did on earth. Wow, okay, he goes inside, takes in the magnificent edifice to see everything that's going on all around him. He sees the maids and the butlers and whatnot, and he thinks, oh, so the upkeep of this home is going to cost me a fortune. And again, the voice says, it's yours, it's reward for all the good you did on earth. Great. He's walking up this long, winding, beautiful spiral stairway made of cast iron and marble, and he looks out the window and he sees this most magnificent golf course, and he says, there's the catch. What's it going to cost me to tee off there? And all of a sudden, again, the voice comes back and says, it's yours to play with whenever you want, 24/7. Well, except for Shabbos, of course. And then later, he and his wife are taking a walk down Main Street Heaven, and they come into this wonderful, magnificent clubhouse. And he takes in all of the food, and he says, so there's the catch. It's going to cost me a fortune to eat over here every single day. And again, the voice says, no, it's yours, it's here, you can go ahead, you're free to eat as much as you want, as often as you want, whenever you want, whatever you want. He says, but what about all the health concerns? No, you can eat what you want, you won't have any health concerns, you're never going to get fat. Live and enjoy for the rest of your life. He says, what, no blood pressure, no sugar levels, no cholesterol to worry about? Nope. Nothing, just enjoy. And suddenly Marvin is glaring across at his wife with thunder in his eyes. And she looks to him and she says, what? What is it? He says, you know what? If it wasn't for you and your stupid bran muffins, we could have been up here already 10 years ago. And the moral of the story is very simple. Our objective is not to escape into heaven. Our objective is to bring a little bit of heaven down to earth. And that's precisely what Kabbalah does. It enables us to get in touch with that greater spiritual realm, as we will discuss, and bring some of that down here. Yes, of course, there were the master Kabbalists, if you like, that we readily read about or that we hear about, who maybe, shall we say, walking with their heads in the clouds. They're a little bit more detached from earth. They're a little bit more in the heavens already, even as they walk this earth. But for the common man, for you and me, there is a purpose to the study of Kabbalah to achieve, again, that very objective of bringing heaven down to earth. And that's precisely what Kabbalah itself tells us, that God created this material world in the first instance, and that we have an objective to make this a place where He can be made to feel at home, to spread spirituality throughout and enable there to be that greater sense of sacred serenity to permeate every facet of our existence. So I got a question. Does anyone here wear a red string? There's one. Okay. Anyone here ever drink Kabbalah water? That's good. I'll come back to that. But let me first begin with the following. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, it's well known that when he first got married, well-known story, his father-in-law was not exactly what you would call somebody who was very pro-Hasidism. So he was particularly disturbed when his son-in-law, now was soon after wanting to get married, going off to study. And not to go study with the Maggid, to go study Hasidism, etc. And he was perturbed by that. And he didn't like the idea. I wanted to go away for a year, then negotiate 6 months. The rabbi is gone 6 months. He comes back home. His father-in-law says to him, no, so what did you learn while you were there? And he says, I now know that God exists. He says, that's what you had to go away, leave my daughter for 6 months? He calls over the maid, Grania, come here. She comes over. He says, you like vodka, right? She says, yes, I do. And vodka comes from grain, correct? She says, absolutely. And where does the grain come from? She says, the earth. And where does the earth come from? She says, God. He says, you see? Even she knows that God exists. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak said, no, you don't understand. She says God exists. I now know that God exists. What does that mean? Well, we talk God, we preach God, we even pray God. But what on earth is God beyond our superficial understanding? That's where Kabbalah comes in, to teach us to know that God exists, to add a new dimension to life, to add a deeper understanding, a greater appreciation, to come to grips with a far greater reality than we might otherwise be readily able to discern. You know, the verse says, "And the world will be filled with the knowledge of God, just as waters cover over the ocean floor." It's a curious analogy. The world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Great. The same way that the oceans cover, or the waters cover the ocean floor. What is that? Is that poetic license? Why that contrast? Why that analogy? And the point being that there is no difference between the ocean's surface and the ocean floor, only that the ocean surface is immediately accessible. That's what you see. That's where you go swimming. That's where you go boating. That's where you go fishing. Truth be told, you can swim on the ocean floor as well. But for that, you need to have special sea diving skills and a uniform and whatnot. You can boat on the ocean floor as well, but for that, you need a special submarine. You can encounter fish on the ocean floor as well, but they're altogether different, more mystique. It's the same water. It's the same ocean. It's just deeper levels, deeper dimensions for which one has to be better equipped. "Whoever is thirsty, let them go and drink," says the verse in Psalms. Torah is compared to water. And the directive and the verse is telling us that if your soul is thirsting, when it goes wanting, then go and drink from the well springs of Torah. To that end, we have what we know as the exoteric dimension of Torah. We have Chumash, we have Mishnah, we have Talmud, etc., Halacha. And then we have the esoteric dimension of Torah, and that is the deep blue sea. They are a sine qua non. You can't separate one from the other. They're as integral as we know Mishnah and Talmud is to the Torah as part of the oral law, so too Kabbalah is part and parcel of the same. If you look at yourself in the mirror, what you see is a physical body. What you don't see is, of course, the soul. But they're both integral. The body cannot exist without the soul, and the soul remains wholly ineffective without the body. Those two, that is, the body and the soul, are interdependent, and they need each other to coexist. Both the candle and the wick need each other if they're to produce the necessary flame by which to light up their surrounds. And that's again where we come into this whole same dynamic about Kabbalah. The exoteric and the esoteric are an integral part and parcel, fundamental components of the Torah. The main substance of the Torah is as we know it. And then, of course, there is Kabbalah, the flavoring, the spice, and the spirit. Now, what we know historically is that in the past, it was something that was only typically pursued by the great and the godly. For others, it remained an alien concept altogether. A very real concept. Kabbalah was a very true concept, but it was alien nonetheless. I know nothing about it. It's surreal, it's abstract, it's ethereal, it's beyond here. It wasn't something ever that was broadly pursued other than by the good and the godly. But then there was a point in time with the advent of the great Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov when all of that changed. The Baal Shem Tov foresaw that Judaism, if you like, for lack of a better expression, was getting stale. The hardcore commitment of what historians term official Judaism ran the risk of losing its appeal to the masses. And so he introduced, or started to introduce, the esoteric dimension of Torah, the Kabbalah. Now that doesn't mean that he started to readily take out tracts of Zohar and start teaching everybody the hardcore Kabbalah. No, he didn't necessarily even teach any of the texts themselves, but the concepts he went about teaching. Even if only in a very subtle way, by way of story, by way of anecdote, nuance and innuendo, conveying messages in that sort of way. And of course, we know that subsequent to the Baal Shem Tov, it was particularly the Hasidic movements which picked up on this and continue to perpetuate it as they do till present day. In fact, if I take you back only maybe 20 years ago or less, There are so many others who still condemn Hasidism in general, and maybe Lubavitch in particular, for being out there and teaching Hasidism, mysticism, Kabbalah in the way that they do. And yet today, so many of the others out there are doing so as well. Because they realize that people are searching, people need something more. In the same way that the Baal Shem Tov recognized that the Torah itself ran a risk of becoming stale. People were becoming a little bit detached. It was just a cold intellect. So too today, people are waking up to that reality. And to be sure, those concerns, those underlying sentiments of the Baal Shem Tov were already articulated long before him as well. The Talmud and the tractate Megillah tells us how a great sage, Rabbi Nachman, was approached to eulogize a man. You must praise him, you must eulogize him. He passed on, and he's an erudite scholar who pursued so many difficult tracts. And you know what Rabbi Nachman's short yet telling reply was? How can I eulogize him? Alas, a bag of books has been lost. Or, taking it a critical step further, the Zohar talks about the word chamar. What is a chamar? Chamar is a donkey. And the Zohar itself observes that this word chamar, meaning donkey, can also be an acronym for Chacham Mufla V'Rav Rabbanan, a wondrous scholar and a rabbi's rabbi. And the point is one and the same as that of the story of Reb Nachman. You could be so incredibly knowledgeable. You can be as revered as you want. You can be an expert in Kabbalistic methodology. But if you are unaware of the soul of Torah, if you're untouched by the oil of Torah, by that spice and spirit, then you risk remaining the proverbial donkey laden with books. And that's why we have this deeper dimension. Now that, of course, gave way to a lot of opposition, as I noted before, but well back already still then. There were those who argued, hey, we have enough to deal with in the context of our own general observance and study. Do me a favor, we have so much that we need to get to grips with, that we need to familiarize ourselves with. I mean, who can start thinking about getting bogged down with anything more abstract? I've got to learn my Mishnah, I've got to learn my Talmud, I've got to get into so much deeper dimension just within that alone. So don't bother me with Kabbalah. Besides, they argue, it was managed for so many years. We coped without it for so many years. My grandfather, God rest his soul, didn't need it. I shouldn't have to bother to go there either. Yes, that's what many argue. If they didn't need it then, why do I need it now? And there are, again, still some who maintain that till present day. What is it they tell about how many Jews does it take to change a light bulb? Change? You can't change that bulb. My grandfather donated that bulb to this synagogue. There are those who might say that the study of Kabbalah or Kabbalistic concepts should simply be avoided. The flaw in the argument is simple and twofold. First, as we said, Kabbalah is not separate from halacha. It's part and parcel of Jewish law, of Judaism altogether, Torah. And if this authentic expression of Judaism, however esoteric, enables people to feel more connected, enables people to get to grips with the essence, then it's got to be the right thing. Moreover, as in the words of the Talmud, Ohev kesef lo yispa kesef, he who loves money is never satisfied with just what he has. He invariably wants to pursue more and more. As with every other facet of our existence, we don't rest on our laurels. We don't rest on our advancements of our ancestors and say, fine, that's good enough. Could you imagine if society said, well, hey, we already have a computer, albeit 20 feet tall. We don't need a desktop, we don't need a laptop, and we certainly don't need an iPad. We already have corded telephones. Who needs cordless telephones, let alone cell phones? We have the vaccine for polio. Why do we need to go and pursue a cure for cancer? With technology, as with medicine and so much else besides, we continuously look to advance, to explore further, to discover deeper levels. Maybe your grandfather didn't need it, but then he didn't need penicillin or a mobile cell phone or an internet. Or maybe he did, only it just wasn't available to him. And so it is the same with Kabbalah. There's a musician who's playing a violin. People are drawn to the beauty of his music, and they're edging ever closer. Soon they're so completely enraptured and enamored by the melody, and they start to jump up and they start to dance, totally caught up in the fervor. Then a deaf man walks into the room, and he sees a bunch of people just jumping around wildly, seemingly aimlessly. And he sees one man at the top over there just gesticulating in such an absurd way with some tool in his hand. And he thinks, they're crazy. They're all mad. But they're not mad, are they? It's just that sadly he is deaf to the reality of the music. Kabbalah is the music of the soul. To oppose it is to be deaf to its inherent melody and the notes that it plays in our lives. So what is it? What is Kabbalah? Well, for one thing, of course, it's a system of what you might call occult theosophy. When you talk about Kabbalah, the term usually conjures up images of magic, of spirits, and so forth. And yes, in today's world, it immediately brings to mind red strings, Kabbalah water, and maybe even Madonna. It stirs emotions of controlling fate and destiny, about the idea of manipulating supernal forces. Yes, again, it's rooted firmly in the biblical and Talmudic passages. It deals with the most profound mysteries of God, of creation, the celestial spheres, angels, souls, and indeed very much helps us to get to grip to understand better the very nature of man himself. For some, it meant even analyzing the most intricate details of life. What many don't realize, interestingly enough, is that so many of the great halacha codifiers that we may be familiar with were themselves also mystics. Nachmanides, the classic commentator on the Torah. Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who is otherwise known as the Ramah of the mid-1500s, who is known as one of the most and greatest codifiers of all time. He was also, believe it or not, a Kabbalist. The author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, also wrote a Kabbalistic tract called Magid Mesharim. Everybody knows the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. What they don't know necessarily is of the Kabbalistic tract that this same author wrote. In fact, interestingly enough, in some of that Kabbalistic tract, he writes things different to what he might write in the halacha. By way of one example, he writes in halacha, of course, about what happens when you come into shul late and where and at what interval do you join the people where they are up to in the service, and how you skip around. And yet in his Magid Mesharim, in his Kabbalistic tract, he talks about the importance of ensuring to nevertheless always daven in sequence because of the different levels of spirituality that you're climbing as you're progressing through the actual prayer services, etc. And there were others that we may be familiar with, the Rashba, the Lavush, etc., even reaching into the Lithuanian world that might have otherwise been known to oppose Hasidism. You had like Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, who lived in the latter part of the 18th century, who quotes his teacher, none other than the Gaon of Vilna, who himself stresses that it is impossible to separate the exoteric from the esoteric, that you need the Kabbalistic dimension as well. And the point, therefore, is this. Halacha is no less essential to the mystic than to anyone else. That goes without saying. As far as the mystic is concerned, halacha is paramount. But where the Kabbalist differs, however, is in his approach, in his consciousness of the universal importance of halacha and its dynamic significance. So for him, it's not just about, I do what I have to do because that's what I'm told to do. It's about what's really going on beneath the surface. What am I achieving? What am I accomplishing through the process of doing this? And it has to be stressed that it's not about first understanding what you're doing before you do what you have to do. No, that's fundamentally wrong. It's not as if, let me first study the Kabbalah, let me first understand what I'm doing, and then pursue the halacha and go and do it. So now I have a deeper appreciation. First and foremost, you do what you have to do because that's what God wants you to do. Then you complement that through the pursuit of the esoteric, through Kabbalah, to develop that deeper appreciation. So, to the mystic, the study of Torah is not just a mitzvah of its own, it also is the means to become transformed. When you study Kabbalah, then when you're also learning Torah, you yourself become like a Torah. It is told about Rabbi Soros, as he was known, a disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich, who would go to him, get this, just to learn how he ties and unties his shoes. And I've often tried to imagine so many of my own congregants lining up just to watch me doing the same. Why? What's his point? The point is that he saw in the Maggid how every single act and motion is an expression of the ideals of Torah. And it's precisely Kabbalah that enables that facilitates that. And that enables him to do everything that he does with a deeper dimension. The problem with our world today is this modern malice, the sterile type of life of scholarship, like we mentioned before, the donkey laden with books, alleged rationale, inquiry, logical positivism, games of linguistic analysis. Everybody likes to get all intellectual. The mystical dimension forcefully counters this and enables us to literally extricate ourselves from that kind of mindset. So here's the bottom line. Yes, there are risks, and we will come to that shortly. The Zohar himself cautions against certain implicit dangers. The great mystic Rabbi Moshe Cardavero talks about those who can become so absorbed in the Kabbalah to the detriment of the practical observance of life, such that they are walking with their heads looking towards the stars while ignoring the holes beneath their feet. But the same Zohar acknowledges that there was always going to be that later point in time, which is really where we are now, when the esoteric becomes paramount, when Kabbalah becomes paramount to our daily learning, studying, and living. The famed Ari explains that, frankly, it's all change in the Ikvasa de Mashiach, the era just before the coming of Mashiach, which he described already at his point in time 450 or more years ago. And again, even the Gaon of Vilna, whom everybody readily assumes is a staunch opponent of Hasidism and whatnot, suggests, quote, all the troubles and all the suffering and the length of this exile is because people don't study Nistar. That is to say, the hidden secrets of Torah, to come and to know the purpose of your individuality in a great universality. You know, a teacher once asked her class where they thought God was. So the first, Sally said, God is in my heart. The second, Joey said, God is in my mind. And the third, Billy said, God is in the bathroom. This is actually a little bit like what Mark Weiner shared with us last night. And the teacher is rather perturbed and says, Billy, why ever would you say that? And he says, because every single morning, my dad is standing there banging on the bathroom door, screaming out, Dear God, are you still in there? So where is God really? Where is God? You know, the world has an idiom, the devil is in the detail. It's a phrase actually coined by some German pop musician, Blixa Bargold. Fundamental to Jewish belief is that God is in the detail. We might think that he only ever exists in the grand and the splendor, only in the big stuff. You know, the exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the sea, he's the force, as may the force be with you, etc. The truth is, he's every bit, and in some way even more so, as it were, in the small stuff, in every fine detail of creation. He is very much there and present, and the question to consider is, well, what would you do if you were God? How might you choose to do things different? And I referenced some of this actually in a previous lecture, but there were three great rabbis who were once debating this very point. And the first rabbi actually said, well, if I was God, I'd make sure there was no poverty in the world. And the other one said, well, if I was God, I'd make sure there was no illness in the world. And the third, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, contemplated a moment and said, well, if I was God, I would do everything exactly the same as it is being done right now. And on one level, clearly what he's saying is obviously that if you're going to say you do something different, that means that God is getting it wrong. And if God is getting it wrong, then he's not perfect. And if he's not perfect, he's not God. But he's actually saying something so much more than that as well. There are imperfections in our world. There are certain apparent faults and flaws in the system, if you like, as perceived only by the naked human eye. But all of that is with very deliberate spiritual intent. If everything was perfect in our world, then frankly, there'd be no point and no purpose to creation. The whole reason why God created a world with certain deliberate flaws is in order to enable us the opportunity to find those flaws, to fill those voids, to discover, to explore, and to then partner him in the actual creation process. Again, as we say in the Kiddush on Friday night, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, that which God created to do. He didn't just create, but he left gaps for us to go about and do. And that's what Kabbalah does again. It helps us fill those gaps. It helps us discover the divine element within the small stuff, to unveil it, to unleash it, and thereby become a partner with God in this world. I can't figure out how to do that by just simply studying a tractate of Talmud. Yes, I need to study that tractate. Yes, I need to go about my basic halachic obligations, but I also need Kabbalah to give me insight into how I can go about achieving this objective. Let me give you a little bit of a soundbite. Let's just look at some of the typical controversial questions that we tend to confront and the Kabbalistic spin on this. Let's look at the human being. Kabbalah teaches us that every human soul possesses 10 sephirot, or if you like, spiritual powers. The first 3 are intellectual, and the remaining 7 relate to the motivating forces, the emotions of man, etc. And these 7 emotive powers are essentially the primary motivating force of your animalistic element, if you like. And that's why so much of Jewish destiny is based on the principle of 3. Just like you have 3 elements of intellect, Chachma, Bina, Das, you also have 3 patriarchs. In our prayers, we talk about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The priestly blessing is composed of 3 verses, 3 individual blessings. Our sages tell us, blessed be God, the merciful one, who gave a 3-fold Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the scriptures, to a 3-fold people, meaning priests, Levites, and Israelites, on the 3rd month of Sivan by means of 3, Moshe, Aaron, and their sister Miriam. Or let's look at how Kabbalah views the nature of women. That's always a big controversial question, which surprisingly didn't come up earlier in the crossfire. Judaism always gets attacked for its apparent view, or negative view, supposedly, on women. You know, one quick little soundbite. When a woman gives birth to a boy, the Torah tells us that there is this time span of spiritual impurity, if you like, first 7 days and then 33 days. And if she gives birth to a girl, then there were 14 days of impurity itself, followed by another 66 days. And the immediate observation that is made by, if you like, the non-Kabbalistic perspective is simply the fact that the girl was born with a womb of her own, through which ultimately she too, please God, will be giving birth. And therefore, if you like, there's this double dose of ritual impurity. Kabbalah takes this on to an altogether different level. You know, we talk about normative order, the number 7 days of the week through which God created the world. That's the significance of the number 8, therefore the time when we do circumcision, because 8 is 1 above 7, transcending the normative order. That's the bond that we established with God. The difference between Isaac and Ishmael was that Ishmael showed off, hey, look, I circumcised myself when I was 13. Yes, you made a rational decision. And that's the sum total of your bond with God, based on your own understanding. Isaac was the first to be circumcised at 8 days old, 1 number beyond 7, beyond the normative order. The idea of an old transcendent bond with God that is beyond rationale, that defies rationale, that transcends the normative order, and that's the way we remain ultimately connected with God. The woman, Kabbalah tells us, contains an innate spirituality. Hence, she's bat mitzvah a year before the bar mitzvah. Therefore, she does not require as many mitzvot than that of a man. This is not apologetics, this is reality. That the idea of her not having as many mitzvot is not because she's being denied, it's not because she's being perceived as less. To the contrary, you take 2 people who go to a doctor, and the first one is told that he's overweight and has to do 200 push-ups a day. The second one is told you only have to do 50 push-ups a day. So is the one who only has to do 50 push-ups a day disadvantaged? Is he going to turn around and say, oh, you're being prejudiced against me? On the contrary, he requires less in order to bring him up to the same potential. The woman, Kabbalah tells us, requires less mitzvot in order to bring her to that same spiritual potential, precisely because she has that innate spirituality within her in the first instance. She doesn't need that added spiritual impetus to maintain her spiritual equilibrium. And the point over here is that the whole notion of, and that's well beyond this lecture, but the whole notion of ritual impurity really reflects the idea of a spiritual vacuum. And as such, because the girl is innately more spiritual, what happens? When a child is born, there's a neshama, a soul in that child. When the child comes into the world, that generates a certain kind of spiritual vacuum within the mother, because a neshama, a soul, a spiritual dynamic is now leaving the mother. And therefore a certain kind of ritual impurity cleaves through which she has to go through a purification process. And because the neshama, the soul of a girl, of a woman, in the first instance is so much more spiritual than that of a boy, of a man, so when she gives birth to a girl, the spiritual vacuum is that much greater, necessitating therefore for her to go through a longer spiritual restoration process, if you like. Just a little insight to demonstrate how Kabbalah is not only kosher, it's vital. But there are three critical provisos, as noted by the mystics themselves. And here we come to the warnings that I referred to earlier. The first, as stated, you cannot separate one from the other. If the body cannot function without the animation of the soul, so too the soul itself hovers in a futile vacuum if it doesn't have the body in which to be able to enclothe itself. You need not to ignore the practical side of Judaism, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Halacha, etc. The second is to appreciate that sometimes when you're studying this sort of stuff, there are things that may be very complex. And then when I suddenly study something and I don't understand it, I might be inclined to say, it is wrong, it makes no sense. Be sure to realize it's not a flaw in the system, it's a flaw in me. I don't understand it, not that it doesn't make sense. Ki lo davar reik hu mikem. It's not a vain thing for you. If it does appear to be a vain thing, it is for you, because of the deficiency in your understanding and your apprehension. And that brings me to the third condition, the third proviso, and that is that Kabbalah would then be forbidden to those who may well come to heresy as a result. And that heresy in itself would typically only be generated on account of one's own sense of self-importance. He's unable to stand in the palace of the king because he thinks of himself too much as wise. And the point is that, the gripping ego is the foremost nemesis of pretty much everything that goes wrong in our world today. It's the cause of so much chaos and animosity, from global wars to personal squabbles, to family disputes, to even between husband and wife. It's all about the pride, the ego, who's going to give in first, etc. There's always some element of ego linked. It's all about self-aggrandizement. So Kabbalah can only be properly pursued if you negate yourself, self-effacement, cast away the prejudices that might be typically imposed by rationalism. At the very least, you need to acknowledge that the reality that is going to be unveiled through the pursuit of the mystical dimension may well run counter to all of my previous preconceived notions and perceptions. Be prepared to acknowledge the fact that everything that I've studied until now, or everything I've assumed rather till now, may indeed be flawed, may indeed be wrong. The Talmud tells us how the great sage Reb Zera, he was a Babylonian scholar. He left to move to the land of Israel, and before doing so, he fasted 100 fasts in order to forget the methodology of the Babylonian Talmud that he had spent so much of his life pursuing. Why? So that it won't bother him and it won't be there when he now goes to study the Jerusalem Talmud. And Kabbalah itself observes man is called Adam, which has the numerical value of 45, the same as the Hebrew word ma, that interrogative, what? What am I? That's the idea, the ultimate humility of man. And that therefore explains that as much as we've highlighted all the way through before that it's the right thing to do, Kabbalah that is, and the study of it, there are those who are doing it all wrong. There are those who are pursuing Kabbalah to their own ends. There are those who are looking today to exploit Kabbalah as a means of a personal pursuit of happiness, but without God featuring necessarily in the equation. They'll tell you, you want to discover life, you want to find eternal happiness, come into us and study. And when they challenge and they ask, why is it that that which I'm advocating is any more or less occult than what you might be doing, then we say, well, who are you people that operate under this sort of banner? When I walk into a shop, I can readily discern between what is kosher and what is not kosher by looking at the label. And in our context, the answer is the same. The mystics themselves categorically stressed that the study of Kabbalah is a sine qua non with the practical observance. And as an intellectual pursuit, like we said, it remains inherently dangerous and subject to serious distortion. We made the point before of how the body needs the soul, the candle needs the wick, and the wick needs the candle no less. The soul, the Kabbalah, needs the body, the basics of Judaism, in order to be able to properly be implemented. Otherwise, you're gazing at the stars but ignoring the holes beneath your feet. So if that's not what's being advocated, if it's just about study the esoteric, study the Kabbalah, get a little bit deeper so that you'll find your internal happiness, that's not authentic Kabbalah. That's defeating the whole point and purpose of what Kabbalah is looking to achieve in your life. How do I define a cult? It's something that's being pursued based on personal feelings. It's about me. It's about my emotions. It's about where I can feel better about myself, regardless of how noble the teachings may appear to be. But the point is that a cult is ultimately going to be devoid of any kind of rational foundation. It's going to lack any kind of valid reasoning. And the belief itself, be it historical or philosophical, has to be condemned, therefore, as a result. So when I'm looking to differentiate between what is authentic Kabbalah being taught by a legitimate teacher and that which is not kosher, again, I have to look at the label, at the underlying basis. Judaism is based upon the public revelation at Sinai, when the Torah was given to the Jewish people. What that means is that there was a historical event at Sinai which attests to the divine source and nature of Torah, and that Torah in turn serves as the exclusive criterion for any subsequent claims and teachings. And again, therefore, kosher Kabbalah, the stuff that your Chabad rabbi would be teaching you, is an integral part of Torah. And Torah determines, therefore, what is kosher Kabbalah. Indeed, the very term Kabbalah means tradition, revealed teachings, handed down and transmitted through the ages. And therefore, its purpose is to follow strictly the teachings and the insights of those time-hallowed traditions. It's the very opposite of inventing personal innovations, regardless of how attractive they may appear to be and how much self-gratification they may offer. So when you encounter something or someone out there who professes to teach Kabbalah and uses it essentially as a launching pad for their own philosophies of life, that has nothing to do with authentic Kabbalah. In fact, it's got nothing to do with Judaism. That they dare to claim to follow traditional Judaism, that they may assert that their activities reconnect their followers with religious traditions, while the very record of their readings, of their writings, of their practices, of their attitudes demonstrate very much the opposite. That they don't have the support of a single religious authority across the world, whether halachic or mystic, speaks for itself. That they argue a rabbi such as jealous of their success, well, that in itself is, again, just utterly absurd. To state as they do, and this comes back to an earlier point which we must bear in mind, that they will not observe mitzvot until you first understand the spiritual reasons behind them, to my mind, is essentially what gives up a game. Because that is a categorical denial of divine authority and of Torah. But more than that, of the most fundamental premise of religion in general. Because ultimately religion is about what does God want from me, not what do I want from God. What I understand? No. It's about what God wants me to get to grips with in the first instance. The studying, the understanding, the deeper appreciation comes later. To argue as they do that their ways reconnect them to religious traditions begs the question, what religion, what traditions? The ignorance in some of the teachings that can be out there and distortion of some of the texts that are out there, not to mention the exorbitant fees that are being charged and the falsification of all the different claims, brings the good name of Judaism and Kabbalah in general into ill repute. And I will tell you very categorically that adherence to Neo-Kabbalism, and in this I will toss Madonna, Call Me Esther, they will not find their ultimate bliss in any way, shape, or form. In fact, when you're meddling with something so dangerous, you run the risk of bringing danger upon yourself. So next time you see Madonna walking, red strings dangling, swinging from a Kabbalah water bottle, run the other way. And if you happen to see David Beckham with his, now in the Hebrew month of Elul, I am to my beloved and my beloved is to me, written on Hebrew on his back, Offer him $10 if he can even read it, let alone translate it. And again, therefore, how do I know what is and what isn't kosher? Well, that's down to you. When you're buying a used car, you're going to make every effort to investigate and evaluate and determine before you're going to hand over your money. When it comes to medical advice, even for something trivial, you still want to make sure you're taking the right medication. If your health and your transient pleasures are so vital, then when it comes to your faith, when it comes to your religion, when it comes to your essence, when it comes to matters of real spiritual reality, you won't simply buy a car because of its external attractiveness or the charm of the salesman. How much less so should you dare to accept philosophical or theological premises just because of the emotional magnetism or their external attractiveness or whatever promised dreams of those soliciting. In summation, the Kabbalah revolution per se is 100% certified kosher. It's the only product in the world that has a hechsher from every licensing authority, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, and of course, God himself. But here, one has to recognize that the ultimate authority is, of course, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the founder of the Zohar, the one who authored the Zohar, and all the way through, all the other greats that follow thereafter who readily attest to its vital importance. And when God gives his stamp of approval on something like that, then he's waiting for you and me to embrace it, to study it, to get to grips with it, whereby the dynamics of our own life will change. But look for the label, research the facts, discern between the bogus gibberish that is out there and the real McCoy, and then come to realize how it can complement your already continuously growing spiritual life. So let me share with you, in conclusion, the following. A man comes to his rabbi and he says, "Rabbi," he says, "my wife and I, it just can't go on like this. We argue all the time. We're driving each other crazy." And the rabbi says, "Okay, you know what? If it's really so intolerable, then I suppose you need to go your separate ways." "But Rabbi, I have to tell you, we've been together for so long already. I mean, we have so much love and so much history together and all of that." And the rabbi says, "Well, you know what? If you really feel still that way, then by all means, go ahead and stay together. But Rabbi, there's hardly a spoken word between us. It's driving us all crazy. The tension is so bad." And the rabbi says, "Well, if it's as bad as you really describe, then I think ultimately you're better off apart." He says, "But Rabbi, what about the impact on the children? And what about the way that they're, the love to be able to sustain them, to grow?" And the rabbi thinks and he says, "The children. Yes, for the sake of the children, maybe you really ought to stay together." "But Rabbi, our common life, it's hell. We can barely coexist." And the rabbi, he thinks for a long time and he says, "You know what? You got to convert to Christianity." And the guy says, "Rabbi, convert to Christianity? How's that going to help?" He says, "It's not, but at least then you go drive a priest meshuggah instead of me." The problem is that with so much instability in our world today, there's a whole new generation out there that, yes, is looking for meaning. Alas, maybe many a rabbi and many a Jew isn't cut out to deal with it. Or more to the point, sometimes too many out there can't bother to deal with it. And we inadvertently send them off. We chase them away. And they go off to their priests and to their cults and to other groups who distort religion, who distort Kabbalah and whatever else altogether. And therefore we have to ask ourselves, we can either recreate ourselves to do what is necessary to help them, as of course Chabad does so beautifully in finding direction in Jewish life, by adding the authentic spiritual and mystical dynamic, or we can, God forbid, lose them to those menacing cults who recognize every Jewish soul as a ticket to heaven. Some years ago, my father, Zol Gesundsein, was speaking on the very real threat of Jews for J. The cults. So-called Hebrew Christians who prey on unsuspecting Jews by using Jewish symbols and so-called shuls, or messianic synagogues as they call themselves. And he described how these individuals make every deceitful effort to confuse ignorant Jews into believing that they're going into a Jewish house of worship. And once they get you in, they bag you. And one woman very innocently asked in the audience, "Rabbi, if I'm traveling out of town and I want to go to shul, how will I know if I'm going into a real shul or one of these imposter synagogues?" And he laughed and he smiled and he said, "When you go into these places, they bombard you. as soon as you see a new face, as soon as they see a new face, a dozen people are going to be surrounding you, welcoming you, giving you a seat and a book and making you feel at home. But I'll tell you what, if nobody greets you, nobody looks at you, and the first person to say a word at you growls at you because you're sitting in a seat, then you'll know you're in a real show. When a soul is seeking its source, we need to be there. But this fact that some synagogues and yeshivot and rabbis and educators today fail to inspire their flock is not rectified by changing our moral principles and by adopting fraudulent means to trick people into a false sense of spirituality. To effect a proper change, we need to reform ourselves, not our faith, not our morality. The great sage, as we know, Rabbi Zusha of Anapol once said, when he comes up to heavens and they're going to ask him, why didn't you become like Abraham? He says, I'll have immediate response. Abraham, God, you appeared to him, you never appeared to me. Why weren't you like Isaac? You gave him an opportunity to put himself on the altar before you. You never presented that opportunity to me. Why weren't you like Jacob? He became the father of 12 tribes of Israel. I only had a couple of kids. He says, whomever, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, I'll always have an immediate and ready response. There's only but one question which, if they ask me, for which I will not have an immediate response, and that is if they say to me, Zusha, why were you not like Zusha? Rabbi Zusha is teaching us a very important lesson, and that is the importance of having an authentic identity. God didn't make me to be like everybody else. If he intended for me to be Superman, then he wouldn't have made me into Clark Kent. Each of us is supposed to be our own Zusha or Chaim or whatever your name may be. And our job is not to imitate the success of others, but rather to go out there and to discover our own unique identity. And it is precisely that Kabbalah itself helps us get to grips with our own destiny, to find out who Zusha really is. God doesn't overimpose upon his creation. He's not asking you to ascend into the highest heavens to escape this earth. We're not asked to become what we're not. All we're asked to do is to be ourselves, to be true to ourselves, to actualize our own true nature, our own abilities, to discern and determine our own individual missions in life. And Kabbalah, as foretold by the Baal Shem Tov, as embraced by the many greats through the ages, and as indeed is available to us today to study in a meaningful and truthful context, is the gateway to finding your true self, to enable you to change your own being, your very world, and indeed ultimately bringing a little bit of heaven down to earth.